could just let other people come in, that'd be great. Has it started recording? Yes, it started recording. Okay, brilliant. So thank you and welcome to this session on Agile Organisational Change. I guess this is part of a series of talks on organisational change, where I've just sort of either tried to develop knowledge in organisational change, or I've taken on board different perspectives on organisational change and see how well they fit into our sort of current knowledge base. So things like, the neuroscience of organisational change is interesting to see how that fitted. I've also done a session on complexity and organisational change, and this session again is similar in that we are probing into whether agile methods have anything to sort of add to our organisational change practice. And as with all these sessions, I go away and I research this stuff. I've never practiced agile in software development, and I've never tried to implement agile within an organisation. So I'm a good sort of neutral observer, I guess, of this, but it also means I probably don't have the in-depth understanding of the practical implementation as well as some of you on the call who have been involved in agile implementations. All I'm doing really is just trying to take an objective view of what the research is saying in this area, and then just taking bits from it and seeing how they apply to organisational change. So don't take any of what I say as sort of the truth or gospel. And I put lots of references in here for you to go away and do your own kind of background reading on this if you think any of the stuff that I'm talking about is of particular interest and you want to deep dive a little bit more into it. On the side, I'm also running talks on how to build change capability. So this is my change capability model that I'm developing or developed and just about to test in conjunction with the Centre for Evidence-Based Management. So I'll be coming out to you guys and asking if you can complete that survey for me so that I can test the robustness of the model. And what I'm doing as well is just going through and just doing talks on each of the individual components of that model. And I'll just very briefly mention that model at the end of this session. So what are we going to talk about in this session? Well, I thought we'd just go into the history of Agile. I always like delving into what these ideas are sort of built on and what the origins are. I also want to contrast that against the history of change management. So there's a tiny bit of repetition there for those people who went to the history of organisational change right at the beginning of this year. And then I'm going to talk about what do we know Agile is, and does it work, most importantly, and what bits of Agile we can take and apply to organisational development, organisational change. And really, I guess where I come down to on this is that Agile development is really about building effective teams. So what does the research tell us about building effective teams, and how does that align with what Agile is saying? And then given all of this, what does the future of organisational change look for? So quite a lot to get through. I'm going to kind of whiz through slides. I will stop at the end of each section and we can have a chat about stuff. We can flip through some slides or just focus on ones that you're particularly interested in. As with all these things, it's always the discussion that's more interesting than me talking, I guess. And when I put this poll up in LinkedIn to ask whether people thought that Agile had anything to add change management, or whether they thought it had a robust evidence base, I actually got quite a sort of split view. Some people thought that it had a lot to offer and there was a strong evidence base. Other people were saying no, and some people just sitting on the fence. So what's the history of Agile? And if you have been on Agile courses, you maybe know this stuff better than I do. actually, what I find interesting about this is that as with most of these ideas, they go back a long way. The idea of iterative design or iterative building dates back to the Bell Labs in the 1930s with this guy Walter Schuhart. I've never heard of him before. And he came up with the idea of plan, do, study, act, which is obviously the classic Deming cycle, which Deming later published in the early 1980s, but obviously was working on that, and actually, his name is associated with that, where it does actually come from, this guy Walter Schuhart. So the idea of iterative processes dates back to the 1930s. But actually, Agile as a software development tool, and this actually wasn't software development, this was big infrastructure or big system builds, were these hypersonic jets that NASA were building during the 1960s, and IBM got involved in that, and then IBM set up their own sort of federal consultancy group, which made billions out of NASA and the US government, and they were using this iterative design or incremental development process, and that later evolved into Agile Waterfall. And we always think of Agile as being the sort of opponent, as it were, of or the opposite of Agile, but actually the original manifestation of Agile had iterative processes within it, which was developed in the UK, and it's very sort of feedback driven, working closely with clients, but actually it was simplified, and they got rid of the iterative bit because that was too difficult, and so you just end up with this waterfall without the iteration piece, is my understanding. And then we get into ideas around adaptive and spiral programming in the 1980s to build, small incremental deliverables with strong feedback cycles involving customers, very much a sort of evolutionary focused approach. And we know in organizational development that evolutionary approach to understanding organizations as systems was very much in vogue during the late 70s and early 80s as well. And then we get development of agile methods, which we're more familiar with now. So we have things like rapid application development. We have extreme programming, XP, which was developed by Chrysler, and Ken Beck, who later wrote the book Extreme Programming Explained, did his work in Chrysler, and then during you get this Agile Alliance coming together in 2001, which I guess we all know about, who produced the Agile Manifesto, and you can go to their website and just have a look at their principles and values, and we'll talk about that later. But I guess that's the point at which Agile became a bit more unified, bringing together all these different Agile methods. And then we get into ideas around Agile change, and ideas around how you build more sort of sorry, that's actually from a different presentation, so ignore that, sorry. But yeah, so let's move into why did it take Agile so long to catch on, from the 1930s, 1960s all the way through. Why did it take so long? And the first point was the point that I mentioned around simplicity. So this idea of iterative design and getting heavy involvement of the customer was seen as being too complex. And as humans, we like things to be linear, and we think of time as a linear sort of process, and that helps us to sort of plan and get ahead around stuff. And this example of the waterfall method, as I mentioned, originally had an iterative process, but they stripped it out to simplify it. There's this sort of illusion of order as well. That if you heavily plan, you get clear accountability, you get clear sort of deadlines, and actually the process becomes more important than the product, and certainly more important than the people. And after a while, this knowledge starts to be embedded, and it starts to be the way to do things, and people are trained. Software engineers, project managers are all trained in these traditional linear methods, and so it becomes very difficult to sort of unpick those sort of ways of doing things. And I guess, it's a similar story that we have now with organizational change, that we've been following, Kotter's model or Adcar's model, or any of these linear processes, are actually finding now that they are maybe not working as well as they should be. And we know that, and we'll come on to this, we know that Kotter and Adcar have gone for more circular processes now, more iterative. At least visually, they look more iterative. So what's the history of change management? And as I said, it's kind of a similar path in a way, in that people knew way back in the 1930s and 1940s and 1950s that organizations are complex systems. And then you get organizational development theories developing around that idea of complex systems. And it doesn't really sort of take off in the way that organizational change methods, these linear methods, took off. From Kotter and Connor, and that's because they were simple, whereas the organizational development methods were a bit more tricky to deal with, or there wasn't one particular model. And certainly we'll have a look at this Birkin and Letwin's model, which was the first tested integrated sort of model of organizational change, looks horrendously complicated on a piece of paper. So it's kind of understandable why these popular change management methods took off, and why organizational development theories kind of took a bit of a back seat in organizational change or change management theory. And this is just to say, we understood that organizations were complex systems way back, and all these organizational development theorists were writing about the challenges of viewing organizations as complex systems. But of course, as we all know, the dominant theories around organizational change came from, Lippitt's model, McKindy's 1983 model, which Kotter then later sort of adapted and made a lot of money out of it. And the issue with these end-step stage models, you've probably seen my sessions on these before, is there isn't one size that kind of fits all. So you have to kind of know every single change method to get one that probably works. And they're not very strong on identifying short-term wins. So this process of iteration, finding short-term wins and building efficacy around change, which is kind of at the heart of the agile process, that team building is through this iterative process, and that's the learning, how people learn, and how you get team cohesion, all the rest of it. That actually it's only Kotter and Adcar who pay much attention to those short-term wins. And as I've said before, the end-step change models, aren't based on evidence, and are sort of out of date and all the rest of it, and that they face the same problems that I guess Agile was facing in terms of traditional methods of project management. And that's why the Agile Manifesto came out, to try and pull all that together and to try and improve the practice. And I guess there's a challenge there, isn't there, around organizational change management, whether we have got to that place yet as a group of practitioners. Have we sort of sat down and said, look, we're not happy with the way our practice is going, we're going to write a set of principles in which we think our practice should be done. So I think there's very interesting sort of similarities between the two methods. That Agile in project management was sort of a revolution against those linear, episodic sort of looking at systems as closed top-down hierarchical approaches, which is kind of what's embedded within organizational change methods now. And I was just sort of debating in my head why that was, and this is my own sort of attempt, which is, we see the world as being complex, and we think, we know it's complex, so we try to simplify it and come up with practical methods, and then we kind of realize, well, they don't really work, so then we have to rejig or jump on another bandwagon, which comes along, and then we go through the sort of the loop again. And I wonder whether Agile within organizational change is kind of ends up as another bandwagon that we jump on, which actually avoids us thinking it's actually the complexity we need to deal with. We don't need a new method. It's our practice accepting that this is extremely complex, what we're trying to do, and there isn't going to be one model that fits all, whether it's linear or whether it's an agile method. Anyway, I'll throw that out there as a point of debate before our first break. So, any quick reflections on that? Bofo, are you? I know someone's been trying to get in. Look at that, bang on 20 people and 200 people signed up. It's always 10%. There you go. I'll move on if there aren't any questions at the moment. So we'll get into what Agile is. Hi, Ellen. Hello.
Hi.
Any thoughts on what I've just talked about? All right, I'm gonna move on.
Alex.
Yes.
Just to add that I think your thoughts and the cycle there really resonated, and it definitely feels like there's a lot of cyclical thinking potentially going on, and we go in these phases, and there's a question as to whether agile change is truly addressing the complexity, or, as you say, it's another way to kind of avoid thinking about the complexity, and we'll end up going into a new phase at some point. But
yeah,
at least we're kind of thinking and talking about it in a realistic way.
Definitely. And I'm positive about agile because I just think that it does. I think its origins are from complexity, and I think it is trying to address the complexity. Certainly gets closer to it maybe than what we have been used to using. So I think it does add value, a different perspective. But anyway, we'll come on to that. But good, thank you for raising that.
Alex, how do you go about choosing which model is suitable when you're looking at change management process?
Oh God, what do? I try and understand the context, and I try and what I call poke the blob, the amorphous blob of the organisation, and see how it responds, and then adapt my way of doing change according to what I think I can get away with in the organisation. So yeah, some organisations are very mature, and you can get on and do some complex stuff with them, and other organizations, you have to start from basics really. So yeah, it all depends. All I can say is that the more I learn, the less I seem to understand about what makes effective change. Yeah, I should stop at some point really. Right, thank you for the questions. Brilliant. What is agile? So okay, this is not a nice slide, is it? But I just I just took quotes out because there isn't a single definition of what agile is. It seems to be first used in 1998 in the context of software development, and that's probably where the Agile Manifesto sort of got its name from. And what I found interesting about this quote here, the one with the hyperlink on it, is that it's not about the practice, and it's not about the process. It's about the people. And actually, Agile came out of an appreciation, a deep appreciation that it's the people that make this stuff work, not the process. Well, if you've been worked in a complex project, and you've seen project managers work, it always seems to be about the Gantt chart, and it's always about following a process and filling out forms, and we forget about the people, which is what Agile was trying to bring. And this is, you've got to read this paper. by Takeuchi and Nakata, who are talking about Scrum. They don't actually mention the word Scrum in their paper. They talk about the rugby approach, and they talk, and it's all about how effective teams work and the dynamics within teams. And both of these guys don't go anywhere near Agile. They're more interested in knowledge creation and knowledge management within organizations. But Scrum took that paper and adopted it for Agile, but it's all about people. And so I was just challenging here, if Agile is really is a people-centric approach to change, then isn't that what organizational change is? So Agile methods are an organizational change method anyway. I mean, the fact that they're applied to software is neither here nor there. They could be applied anywhere. And this is, of course, the classic Agile Manifesto. And when you read through this, you find it's about the customer, it's about individuals. It even mentions that you shouldn't be working more than 40 hours a week, and it talks about the well-being of individuals and programmers, and the importance of face-to-face conversations here, and the idea of just getting software that works. It doesn't matter whether it's got to be the simplest form, and it's got to work, and we move in increments. We don't go for like a big bang approach. We're going for simplicity. So yeah, and the sentiment of this is wonderful. I think I love this. I love the way that this is written and the whole idea. And as I've been reading through all the literature on Agile, I sort of try to summarize the states that people need to be in order for Agile to work. So that original paper on the rugby approach talks about self-transcendence. So we can't be interested in ourselves. We've got to transcend ourselves and transcend into the group that we are working in. But at the same time, we have to keep our own autonomy. We have to be able to collaborate. We have to be able to self-organize. Team cohesion is critical, but at the same time, we need to create tension in the team as well. So they talk about the Scrum paper talks about not being particularly clear, or just giving very high level goals and allowing people to thrash out exactly what is required. So this process of sense making through the group as well, and transfer of learning. XP, for example, talks about having two programmers working all the time, and that's through transfer of learning. It's about reducing individual bias. It's about challenging each other. And these iterative feedback processes as well, very customer centric. So for me, this is the sort of essence of Agile, and the outcomes are that, and we'll go on to the research that supports this, that we get high levels of stakeholder satisfaction, we get high levels of well-being amongst developers, we get improved learning, and we get efficiency because we can more easily respond to requirements and minimize costs. Now, what we're trying to do is to prove whether these outcomes are actually there. Whether Agile actually does lead to improved outcomes, and what the evidence is. So that's what we're going to explore. Before we do, though, I just want to go through these methods in a bit more detail. This is Extreme Programming, which I bought this book to read about it. This is Ken Beck's book on, and it's surprisingly there aren't any processes or hardly any process flows diagrams in here at all. It's all talking about people and how people work together, and uses a lot of talk through scenarios of how people work together on XP. And he comes up with these values: communication, simplicity, feedback, courage, respect. But when you look at these, communication, for example, he's really talking about psychological safety. He's talking about people feeling comfortable to be able to, make comments. And equally, when he talks about courage, he's talking about the courage to speak up and challenge other people. And again, he talks about respect within the teams. and again, that's about psychological safety. So I think that whole piece about XP and how it fits in with change management and all what we know about organizational development is that you can't have an agile organization or an agile culture without first developing psychological safety. So that's very clear for me. But I love this idea of having the idea of building a minimum viable product. So simplicity first, proving that something can work by developing it rapidly. And we know that feedback is so important for developing interpersonal skills. It's really important for complex systems to work effectively. We'll come on to why I think Agile is so good for dealing with complex systems as well. It seems to have all the attributes that help complex systems work. So yeah, they're just some thoughts on extreme programming, but it certainly does hark back to what we'll talk about around attributes of effective teams. That the effective teams, you can look at effective teams through their social states, through developing psychological safety and trust, and you can also look at effective teams through their cognitive states. So how do they share information? How do you tie into this collective memory? Where do you go for the knowledge? Which is all very much about how XP works. But we'll come on to that later. The other key method as well, and most of the research is actually done on extreme programming. There is some research that's been done on Scrum, and I guess how Scrum works, and this is very much the incremental side of Agile, I guess. So XP is giving you what the behaviors should be around it, and Scrum is giving you the sort of the process that you should be working with. And again, this idea of Scrum comes from the rugby approach, which comes from that article from the early 80s. And this is from that article that I mentioned before, that talks about the rugby approach. And they talk about this sort of traditional sequential linear approach, and then moving to more this overlapping approach, that you're not waiting for one thing to finish before you start something else. So you don't wait for your functional requirements to be written necessarily until you start developing, and you don't and you test as you go. You don't have to wait for the system to be built before you can test the whole system. You're doing more unit testing and iterative testing, and that's the sort of level C, where you're sort of starting one task before you finish the other one, where there's a lot of overlap and phasing, and this is the kind of the Scrum approach that we talked about there. So this is an early conception, and I think if you look at this and try and translate it into organizational change, behavior doesn't happen in blocks, does it? Behavioral change doesn't happen in blocks. We don't sort of say, right, we're going to change this behavior today, and then we're going to move on to this other one. Because it's a complex system, we'll go in and change one behavior, and then we'll find there's lots of knock-on effects. So actually, we're dealing with lots of change at the same time, which seems to lend itself more to this overlapping approach. So any comments or views on what Agile is? I sort of started with that definition and then talked about methods, and then linking it maybe to or visually trying to link it to what happens in organizational change. So this all sounds fantastic, and sounds exciting and interesting, and I love the iterative approach, and I love the people approach to Agile. But does it work? Does it actually do what it says it does on the tin? So I'm just going to go through a few bits of research on this, and these are the ones that I found most helpful. And there's this guy down here. There's no way I can pronounce his name, and maybe. Oh, hang on, I'm going to switch. Can you just make sure your mics are off? Oh, Rick, I'm going to turn you off. Oh yeah, thanks, Rick. So yeah, there's this systematic review of Agile. So that's 36 studies on Agile software, and as I mentioned, the majority of them on extreme programming. Some are just on sort of general agility. So obviously agility is just a mishmash of different kind of methods, and people just sort of pluck out. So they're sort of just general stuff, and 3% on Scrum, 3% on Lean, and they sort of rated these studies according to rigor and credibility and relevance. Thank you. And this guy here, person, I don't know whether they're male or female, sorry, is Ding Shaw. I don't know, Love, whether you recognize that surname, but I'm not sure how to pronounce it if somebody else does. But he's done it. They have done a lot of research on this, and I'll be using their research a lot as we go forward. But they talk about, just let me see if I've got a bigger version of this. Yeah, they break down their investigation into 4 areas, which is around the adoption and introduction, and they find sort of mixed results of introducing Agile. Some studies moving away from waterfall found it positive. Other people, particularly complex organizations, big organizations, sort of struggled with it, and we'll come into why that might be. It seems to work very well with maybe isolated small teams. And then they talk about the human factors. They talk about XP can thrive in different types of organizational structures, and it's reliant on improving collaboration and self-efficacy, and improves well-being, which we talked about earlier. And they found that extreme programming worked best for experienced teams, which kind of makes sense because XP, I imagine, if you work in that environment, can be quite intense and quite challenging, and if you don't feel up to it, you're getting lots of fairly candid feedback from people about, I don't know, the quality of your coding or whatever. So you need to be quite robust and resilient, and I guess experienced, and that comes with experience. So perceptions of agile methods among stakeholders is high, and it's popular amongst developers as well. And this idea of paired programming, which is part of extreme programming, people found that kind of difficult when there's an imbalance in skills. So if you've got one person who's much stronger at coding than somebody else, that would turn more into a mentoring, I guess, relationship rather than an equal relationship. But students who use XP find it great to as a learning process. So that sort of idea, of having a kind of an apprenticeship might work well with XP. And then comparative studies. So what I really found interesting was this sort of feedback from the studies that Agile was seen as more of an operation. So projects we seen as being distinct from operations, don't we, because they've got a distinct start and finish. Whereas Agile projects are actually more operational because they don't necessarily have a distinct start or finish. And so it was interesting to see that actually, because it's ongoing and it's incremental, it's seen more like managing an operation than managing a project. Actually combining gating from your normal sort of linear approach to project management combined with Agile can be quite powerful, and gives Agile a bit of extra discipline. So actually mixing Agile with traditional methods can be quite effective as well, and we'll talk about that later. And what you find with Agile, is that there's sort of very high productivity on the first iteration of the software, and then it kind of dies away. So it out competes traditional methods on the first kind of iteration. But then, because it's just incremental, you find that sort of productivity falls off because you're just sort of tweaking with the code, I guess. And Agile, you tend to get high levels of code being produced, which which kind of contradicts the simplicity principle. But I guess it all depends on how you're measuring productivity, because if you're measuring productivity through lines of code, Agile might be seen as being more productive. So not necessarily seeing high levels of team cohesion. And also in Agile teams, it's difficult to reassign them in projects, I guess, because it's just a distinct start and finish. People know they're going to be in a project for a limited amount of time, and you can move them around, and that's kind of, whereas within Agile, I don't know this, because it feels more like an operation. Maybe it's more difficult to move people around because they become so specialized because they're working on specific areas of code, maybe, I don't know, but these are the findings which are quite interesting. So there's sort of mixed findings from that piece of research. And then this other one, more recent empirical study. So this was actually just going out and running a survey amongst stakeholders and developers to find out whether Agile sort of works or not. So 859 practitioners collected from PMI and LinkedIn, surveying over 1,386 projects. And they were sort of asked to rank the success of projects against different criteria: budget requirements, client satisfaction, and overall success. And Agile seemed to have a statistically significant impact on 3 dimensions. So the efficiency, which I guess is the budget and requirements piece, the stakeholder satisfaction, overall success. But what is critical for Agile, which kind of makes sense, is that the vision and the goals are a significant moderator of success. So if the high level goals of what you're doing aren't clear, then I guess Agile could go off, or Agile developers can go off in all sorts of directions unless there's clarity around what the project is trying to achieve. And team experience and project complexity weren't found to moderate the success of Agile, which I guess is a potential positive. But overall, you get high levels of statistical significance, but small effects. So it's not a huge positive effect that they're finding with Agile. And what was also interesting was, counter to what you might think, there's actually a lot of planning that goes into Agile before you actually get into Scrum or get into the iterative. So actually there was as much planning in Agile as there was in traditional methods. And it seems to work well in high-tech environments and in health. And I don't know whether that's just because people who come from those environments tend to have a more positive view of it than, say, people who've used it in other areas. And then this study, which I thought was interesting, which was looking at what the key success and challenges were of implementing Agile. And this is 52 publications, 42 case studies. 90% of the research studies that we used were from experience reporting, so case studies, not very high levels of validity. So lack of sound academic research in this, but nevertheless, all the comments were sort of coded up, and you end up with these kind of themes. And I've tried to link these themes together, the key themes that came out from the research, and that was, Agile was difficult to implement because different people have different understandings of what Agile means, and then they end up reverting back to the old ways because people aren't clear. So that's one of the challenges. One of the success factors complementing that, I guess, was that it's successful when people conform to a single approach. So you don't have some people doing Agile, some people doing traditional methods, some people mixing it up. So we're very clear on what Agile is and where we're going with it. So I thought that was an interesting sort of paradox there. And then other areas seem to support the idea that if you can't kind of do Agile locally, because Agile involves so much involvement from customers, and it involves them changing the way that they work and the way that the software engineers will interact with the rest of the business, then in fact it's a whole business change. And so, one of the drawbacks was that other functions were unwilling to change. They weren't willing to, I guess, be part of Scrum or be, be regularly called upon to look at or to see the latest code or the latest development. And so, yeah, we can't just think of this as a sort of a localized issue, and that then creates resistance, which you can see at the top there. And so there has to be some kind of mindset change and alignment in order for that to happen. So the successful projects managed to create, they concentrated on agile values and created this sort of mindset shift. Had social events and cherished agile communities and aligned the whole organization to agile. So it's no mean feat, I guess, trying to implement agile in organizations. And then we look at the factors even more recently. This is a sort of an empirical study on the factors that seem to affect agile. And the strongest factors, and when we come on to what makes effective teams, this fits very closely with what the organizational development research tells us about how well, or what are the factors that make effective teams. And this is around, the team's ability to utilize knowledge, team members' motivation and commitment, which is the team capability there, the level of customer involvement. So are you involving stakeholders in your development? Personal characteristics was kind of strong as well, and how the group learns and how they train and get that sort of technical expertise. So we'll come back to that, but I thought that was also interesting. And then this most recent study on the factors which seem to be duplicating what we can see from other studies, which is around, management support is critical. Their buy-in to agile is critical. That we need to focus on creativity sort of behaviours, so creative thinking and articulating a vision of the future. And we talked about the importance of purpose in agile, and that we've got to create an environment where there's fast response, where there's decisiveness, where we're driving through the barriers. You can see the kind of culture that you would need to make agile work, and obviously we've got trust in there as well. But again, these aren't organizational development or psychological constructs that they're talking about here. Trust is, but it doesn't mention psychological safety. And this is one of the fundamental problems, I think, with agile, which we'll touch on, is that it's a great idea and it's probably a lot of this stuff is true, but it doesn't have any sort of theoretical grounding in organizational development or psychology, i.e. what we understand works well in effective teams and organizations. And so what we end up with is this paper. This was actually written in 2012, which just says, agile doesn't have, is kind of atheoretical. It's just stuff that's made up by programmers in practice, but isn't tested sort of scientifically. And until agile researchers embrace a more theory-based approach, then it's very difficult to know whether agile really works or how it works. So we need to provide a robust theoretical scaffold for conducting agile research. And that zoom in thing isn't working, which is annoying. But this comes back to the point that I'm always making about construct validity, that if we don't have a clear definition, we don't have a clear scope of what it is we're talking about, and agile doesn't have a clear definition. Kind of the scope maybe is clear, but it's so many different methods are pulled together. And if we don't understand the relationship between the constructs, what's the relationship between Scrum and XP or whatever it is, then we don't have a coherent coherent construct. We don't have a coherent theory or framework. And this actually reminds me very much of neuro-linguistic programming, which is a pulling together of lots of different things. Some of them are already being tried and tested in organizational development and psychology, and we know that they work. And other things are just really nonsense. They're just sort of being made up and popularized. And I kind of feel Agile, sadly, I kind of feel Agile is in the same situation, you know, that some of the methods that they use might work, some of the stuff that Ken Beck talks about might work, but unless it's grounded in some theory or some testable construct, we won't know. So any views on that? I've kind of come to my end of my Agile piece, I guess, about just Agile and what it is and what potentially whether it works. And any comments, any controversies I've sparked?
Well, Alex, I have just one thing about the Agile research, because especially if you try to discern how Agile work in like large organizations, I think there's a methodology problem. I mean, we have decades of research for like we can call them waterfall approaches, but these are rather new studies. I'm just thinking about the methodology. I mean, it's also hard to find a sample of a big size that can be really comparable. So I'm just guessing there's a lot of methodological.
Problems. I can't say either. But
yeah, sorry, I'm it's too late for me. But anyways, so that's just a point that I'm guessing that it's kind of hard to the case for there should be much more research done, like in a few years forwards, to really have a more robust foundation for the research itself.
Yeah, and there was a paper published around creating a framework for doing research into Agile in the future, because I think researchers were getting frustrated with the quality of the research in Agile, and so they have put, but I don't know whether that framework has been adhered to. You know, certainly up to 2022 I couldn't find anything. In fact, the quality of the paper seemed to have got worse. But yeah, any other comments, or shall I crack on? I haven't really got 75 slides to get through. There's lots of additional slides there. Okay, I'll push on. Please just speak out as and when I sort of provoke you enough to. So what does Agile mean for organisational change? You know, is it just sort of old wine in new bottles, which is always a favourite kind of quote on these kind of things, where we can't really prove whether stuff works and they're just borrowing from already known things that do work. These images on the left-hand side were taken from the Agile Business Organization, who define Agile as an organization that can respond quickly and effectively to opportunity threats found in the internal and external environment. And the thing is about that is that is what OD is. That's what organizational flexibility is. That's what organizational change capability is. That's what organizational capacity is, organizational buffering, all these different names that we use for organizational change. Even HR strategic management, you look at the quote there, or even change management, they're all about adapting internal capabilities to meet external challenges. For me, it's as simple as that. And so what you end up with their framework is they just put Agile in front of everything. So they just say, well, leadership's important. Okay, well, we'll call that Agile leadership, or strategy is important, or purpose or directions. That's Agile strategy. People are important, so we'll call them people, Agile people. And, it's just not, and then there's Agile culture as well that you'll see there. I don't know how you separate culture from people, but it's not helpful, I don't think. The way that Agile organisations has been defined here and generally, and in fact, I just copied this slide from a slide that I was doing on organisational resilience, and organisational resilience is the same idea as well. It's how organisations respond to impact from external forces, and this dates back, to ideas around social cohesion, that organizations as complex systems can resist external challenges because there's sort of this internal social cohesion levels model, the 1960. There's ideas around organizational adaptation through the evolutionary approach that I mentioned, that Agile kind of came from, that thinking during the 70s and 80s around evolutionary approaches to organizational change. So yeah, people in OD and people have been thinking about this stuff for a long time. So you know, the idea of an organization to be able to adapt to its external environment is by no means new. What also isn't new is the idea of challenging linear approaches, and this was a shock to me. I never thought that I was the first person to challenge all the Kotter and Adkar stuff, but certainly I didn't realise it dated back to this book, which I'm starting to read, which is fascinating. It's a kind of a case study of ICI and how it managed to, or didn't manage to adapt to its environment. And here Pettigrew is talking about, you know, challenging traditional linear approaches to change, and how change actually happens sporadically and in packages, and you know, it's incremental, and it's and organizations tend to learn by doing, and this requires openness and flexibility in management. So that's very much a view of, look, organizations have to be agile by nature, and we're trying to fit them into a box of being linear and controllable. So that's that. And I'm going to talk about this because I think it's really important. It looks complicated, but you know, these linear models, and I'm not anti-linear models, but it comes out of this idea that, you know, that change happens to people, that people are controllable variables, and that we can, you know, we can move, we can adapt people, we can change their behaviors or whatever. So it's kind of a reductionist view that, you know, everything is kind of controllable and things are things, and that's this this top right corner, and then there's this what's called the process narrative, where it's sort of saying, well, actually things come into being not because we can control them, but because of humans bring things into existence through you know, through meaning making, through their perceptions of reality. So actually change becomes kind of a, you know, a lived experience, and isn't really that sort of controllable, although you can control the context in which people work. You get extreme views of that, which is this approach 3 down here. So, you know, we change through narration and through emergent actions, and everything is kind of chaotic and kind of up for grabs. And this is more maybe aligned to sort of agile approach. But then we've seen from agile that agile is actually needs a lot of planning up front. So, but I'm not saying any one of these is good or bad. I'm just saying that, and Helen's question earlier, that we have to use approaches that are suitable for the environment in which we are working, and sometimes we have to be highly structured and highly reductionist maybe, and use these variance methods, and other times we just want to let things go and see how they work and be more emergent and let change come into being. So yeah, I think that's an interesting kind of view. And then I tried to put this into this sort of structure, which is moving from linear, that one thing follows after another, to understanding. So this is kind of like the evolution of change, or thought around change, or epistemologies around change, that actually we don't go from one change to the next. You remember those blocks, that block model that we saw earlier from the rugby approach. That actually there's parallel change going on in organizations, and so one change can affect another, and there's obviously relationships between these different changes. And then we think, you know, well, actually change happens in an iterative, we're going round kind of in circles, as it were, from that plan, do, review type thing, from the sort of Deming cycle. And you can see this is kind of where Adkar and Kotter have got to. The big opportunity, Kotter calls this 8-stage model now, the big opportunity, and he's just put these 8 stages into round things to emphasize that actually they're iterative, which not really a big change. And then we understand that all these different stages are actually interrelated to one another. So there's feedback loops within this sort of recursive process. And then I think, you know, where we need to get to is this what's called conjunctive view, which is the fact that we have iterative processes taking place along a linear system. And this is why I think or combining the sort of agile approach with a linear approach is actually probably fairly optimal kind of solution. Some things have to be structured, like the direction of the organization and governance structures and I know legal structures, financial structures, whatever it is. But we need to understand where we have degrees of freedom and where we can experiment and where we can try and change. And yeah, I like these sort of descriptions, and I like the idea of a movie, that we're not in stop motion movie sort of mode. With the linear approach, we've got to move to more fluid approach to seeing, you know, pictures and stories emerging through time. So and you can see this in history, in the history of development. You know, Shen's framework, where it is hierarchical and linear, although he never drew a pyramid, and he's later recounted this and sort of said it's more of a lily pad pond type of thing with complex systems underneath. But anyway, this is the way it's been interpreted. The same with Maslow's hierarchy. He never drew a pyramid. But I'm a big fan of Joe Hatch, who came up with this sort of recursive model of Shen's model, which we went into detail on in previous sessions on building change capability. But what the recursive model assumes is that there's some kind of updating going on, and it's called, in complex systems, it's called Bayesian updating. And we're constantly updating our beliefs and constantly updating maybe what we think we're capable of, or questioning our assumptions here that then form new values, new artifacts, new symbols, and then background. And this is, I guess, what Agile is, appreciating that actually we work, our brains, the way that we are, works in a recursive process. We're constantly projecting out onto reality and getting feedback of our reality and checking whether our internal reality is the same as the external kind of reality, which is how we go about one of the methods we can use for changing behavior. So yeah, I think that's certainly a strength of Agile. And when you look at when people have tried to come up with Agile change, organizational change models, they've got this recursive process in here. I just found a couple. These are the only ones that I could find. Maybe you're familiar with others. There's this one from France by Moutot, who has this sort of iterative changing process. And then Legrand here actually talks about having you know, an experimental phase. So we define up front, then we experiment and have lots of iterations around change, and then we move to a sort of anchoring phase where we're trying to embed the change. And there's Melanie, I think it's Melanie Franklin, has also come up with this idea, well, has sort of taken Agile change and moved it into this idea of having waves of behavioural change. I'm not so sure about this model, because I don't think you can necessarily control waves of behavioural change. You might impose one behavioural change and then find a knock-on effect to lots of other behaviours. But to think that you can orchestrate lots of waves of behavioural change, I think is potentially tricky. So there are the models that people have tried to use in organisational change, adapted from Agile change. I just thought, you know, that there is this kind of debate, I guess, between the people the people side and the process side, that Agile is more around the people and creating creativity that allows, you to embrace high levels of change, whereas the process approach is more relying on the process to make the change, and it becomes more predictable. And what you're trying to do is reduce variation. And this is a sort of a summary of that you could these things aren't dichotomous and they don't fit into camps, but this is, I think, what we're talking about. And sometimes we need efficiency and predictability, and we need to reduce variability, and we need to fix scope, we need to do all this stuff and have control. And sometimes we need to be able to co-create. We need creativity, and we need organic, let things sort of grow organically. It's just knowing when to do this. And kind of why you're doing it. So yeah, sort of integration of those two methods. And this is a session that I've run on complex systems, and I think this agile approach works very well with complex systems because it takes into account the fact that systems do naturally descend into disorder through diversity, and that there is feedback, and there isn't an equilibrium or necessarily a one way to do things. And that if you allow the system to do those things, i.e. you allow for feedback and diversity of thought, and appreciate that there isn't such a thing as an equilibrium, then you get more robust systems. They can adapt to external environments more effectively because you've got you're allowing the system to learn from experience. It's got history and memory through the feedback processes that allows adaptive behavior. We appreciate there's non-linearity in the system as well. So things can go off in all sorts of directions and go horribly wrong, which is where we need the structure and to bring it back, because we get positive feedback loops, which aren't necessarily good. They can be good, but they can get out of control, and we maybe need to bring in some negative control loops to bring the system back to a more steady state. And then you get this idea of self-organization within agile systems as well, that we want to leave groups to self-organize, hence creating a bit of sort of chaos at the beginning by not giving specific requirements, and you let the people work out the best way and kind of the simplest functionality that delivers the user requirements. And this is just sort of exploring that in a bit more detail, that systems might move from being fully disorganized to relationally organized as they get these feedback loops working. And we know this is all very clear in the literature around effective teams, that we've got to get these feedback loops working. We don't want teams to get into equilibrium and sort of groupthink. We want them to have diversity of thought and constantly jolting each other out of their sort of comfort zones, as it were. But over time, complex systems and all those feedback loops will tend to sort of settle, and you'll get organized units within that environment. So you'll find, if you think about work, that you end up working with the same people all the time because they're the people that you need in order to get work done. So you form a group. So you get this sort of self-organized, it becomes self-organized. And then ultimately that ends up as a fully organized structure, because somebody comes along then and says, right, well, you're working together all the time. I'm going to call you the finance group, and I'm going to call you the HR group because you work on HR stuff. And then you start to build in rigidity into the system. Potentially becomes less adaptive and less robust, and you get the sort of the silo kind of effect. So again, it's trying to balance all of this. And what I think is interesting is that what OD does, and what we can do organizational development, and what we can do with organizational change, is we can understand the levers that we can pull that allow us to balance a disorganized against an organized system. Sometimes we need disorganization, sometimes we need organization. So what are the levers that we can pull? Well, the levers that we can pull are having clear purpose, creating cooperation, giving employee voice, i.e. allowing feedback within the system, creating clear procedures. So that's around organisational justice, so that people understand the boundaries in which they can be kind of disorganised, as it were. One thing that should be on here that's been lost is psychological safety as well, that we can dial up or dial down psychological safety to give the system less or more responsiveness. So what I'm interested in my research is understanding what capabilities it is that we can change that allow an organisation to become more or kind of less adaptive, to get that autonomy and structure balance right, given whatever challenges they face. And good old McKinsey, have handed it to us on a plate. They've said that organisations are machines, hierarchies are machines. We get silos, and yeah, maybe if you overstructure an organisation, you end up with this. And what they're saying is we should revert to this organism kind of approach, without a hierarchy. And I don't buy that. I kind of think that complex systems do arrange themselves into hierarchies for good reason, because they're very efficient, but you've got to try and balance this sort of autonomy within the hierarchy. So I've sort of cheekily combined their two diagrams into one diagram, and the things that facilitate this autonomy at the lower level, the agility at the lower level, are these things that are well defined with the organizational development, like employee voice and fairness and psychological safety and all the rest of those things that we know make adaptive organizations. So yeah, this was sorry, I'm running out of steam a bit. I went on for I hope I've kept your attention, but yeah, this is just sort of saying that I think the agile methods that we are talking about allow for systems to be complex systems to be adaptive, because it allows for Bayesian updating, the updating of people's beliefs and adaptation of people's beliefs. It allows for what we call Markov blankets, which is the idea that I'm separate from everything else, that teams are separate, that organizations become separate from their outside, which is critical for complex systems, because if everything was the same, then nothing would kind of exist. Anyway, you can watch my session on complex systems to learn more about those. So what does the research tell us about effective teams? Well, first of all, we have to think about what a team is, and it's something that's kind of formally established. We are a team. Maybe we give ourselves a name. It's assigned some autonomy, but it's also signed. It also has some interdependence on other areas as well. So other people are relying on it to deliver. And then how do we measure effectiveness? This is the tricky bit. We need to be clear about what we mean by effective. Is it task performance? Is it how well it adapts? Is it behavioral? Is it cognitive? Is it a sort of a permanent state? Is it a changing state? So anyway, lots of questions around what we mean by effective. But what the research seems to tell us is that the cognitive state of a team, i.e. how good it is at sharing information, how good the collective memory is, how easily you can get to sort of a cognitive consensus, is critical for effective teams. And I'm running a session on this later on relationships, where I talk about effective teams in more detail. And the social states are sort of trust, psychological safety, social cohesion, and team identification. So how committed I am to the team. And a small direct impact on performance of effective teams as well is how well the team can question, challenge, and reflect. And I think hopefully you'll agree that all these attributes of effective teams are actually what we see in agile teams, and that potentially is no surprise, and it's a good thing that agile actually is saying to us, look, if you want to be adaptive, you've got to endorse kind of these methods. And certainly extreme programming mentions all of these things very much in terms of particularly around how to get that collective memory working and information sharing and all the rest of it. All I'm trying to do is just codify what Agile are saying in a framework within sort of testable constructs, as it were, and within evidence and research evidence. Okay, so and this is just more detail on what we mean by intra-team tasks and psychological safety and all the elements of the social states, and more on the team cognition states, which I find are more difficult to understand. But you know, this idea of people having similar mental models, they all understand where they're going, so you can have very robust, candid conversations and direct conversations about what you're doing because you're both so aligned. And this is the sort of twin programming idea from XP, and you know, the idea of teams really challenging each other and creating maybe a bit of conflict in order to understand what it is that the other person's got in their head about where this coding's kind of going, as it were, and very much an emphasis on learning within Agile as well. And if we're looking for a good team model, this is one. And I'll be talking about this in more detail in my session on relationships. And another interesting piece of research as well, and I think this is important for Agile, is that, you know, Agile, as I mentioned, talks about kind of creating task conflict, and the research seems to suggest that that task conflict can actually positively affect performance, which I thought was interesting. And this relates directly to that rugby approach, you know, the Scrum approach, which is, you know, we've got to build in instability. Broad, challenging goals create tension, creating self-order. But we need to be autonomous and self-transcendent, and there needs to be cross-fertilization, i.e., you know, sort of learning. So very much in that vein. However, if you have conflict within relationships, then that will detrimentally affect performance. And what underpins all of this is the process, is fairness of process, and we know that's really important from theories around organizational justice. And that really, if the process isn't clear of how you're going to get stuff done, then everything else falls apart. It will, you know, push relationships and tasks as well. So process kind of trumps all, as it were, being clear on how you're going to do stuff, and then that'll help build relationships and get the tasks rolling. So I thought that was an interesting angle. So that's it, really. All I wanted to do was a quick sales pitch for what I'm developing, which is how we combine. Remember, we talked right at the beginning about the sort of variance model, the sort of reductionist, we can measure everything kind of thing and control things, all the way through to and combining that with the process approach, this sort of iterative agile approach. So how do we get the linear working with the agile? And for me, it's about, you know, baselining what is the current state of the organization in terms of the handles that it can pull to be more adaptive. Do you remember I talked about, you know, fairness and autonomy and psychological safety and having clear purpose and all the rest of it, and feedback are so critical for an organization to be adaptive. So we need to measure where we are with those adaptive states, which is the sort of variance model. This, you know, we're going out and empirically testing the organization, and then we say, right, we need to be better at psychological safety. So we run interventions around psychological safety, and then we let the process side sort of take over, get some generative change going, and sort of, as I said before, sort of touching the blob, and then we can run pulses and see whether we're building that capability to change and testing our interventions. And that also combines in the sort of evidence-based approach and the experimental approach as well. So yeah, that's what I've been working on. And that's just my summary of this. I'm not sure how kind of relevant that is. So yeah, I'm going to open the floor now. So thank you very much for listening. And I think I've managed to hold the audience because I think I've only lost one person. But yeah, open floor now. And I need to get some water because my mouth has gone dry from that. So please, what are your thoughts? Thanks for the thumbs up, by the way. I hope that was interesting. Go for it,
Great, Alex. Thanks very much. That was really, thanks for sharing all of your thinking on that. It's really, really interesting. I guess you sort of mentioned the difficulties around Agile and the sort of the you know, the sort of the identity of it. The sort of the I think I can't remember you call it, like the, you know, the construct problem that we have with what we actually mean by Agile as such. And to sort of feel immediately there's one around, well, if we're talking about Agile change, or Agile organizational change, there are lots of layers. There's the sort of the organizational development layer. There's a kind of, you know, how do you get an organization to be more agile, or how do you adopt a specific agile method, you know, those elements. And then there's also, how do you, you know, can we do an individual change in a more iterative agile way? And then there's even, how do we do change, but, you know, people change with agile method projects, if you see what I mean. There's so many different sort of elements and layers to it, but they all sort of, you know, it feels like there's definitely, as you sort of say, some kind of conjunctive model which brings together, you know, a high level linear, you know, so you're not just going in with a blank sheet of paper, you know, you've got a kind of a framework for actually allowing proper iteration and you know, all the elements that you sort of you've identified from Agile to come through. But there's so many different layers to it.
Yeah, there are, aren't there? And I guess that's a good thing and a bad thing, isn't it? Because it becomes someone's just said, wow, that's a really good, it is a great summary of the way that you sort of said it, and it is complex. I think we're opening our arms, aren't we, to, there's so many ways in, which is a good thing. It's different, it's not, it's a bad thing in a way, because it is difficult, isn't it? But if we're good OD practitioners, or we're good at change, or whatever it is, we know when to come in, don't we? We know when to test some of the behaviors around Agile to sort of see, okay, right, is this organization able to sort of adapt? Let's try it with this team, or let's try it with the senior leadership team, or let's try and adopt a more, you know, sort of Agile thinking around a very linear project, which I'm sort of working on at the moment as well. Can we just change the thinking a little bit? Yeah, so it's interesting, isn't it? Yeah, that there's so many ways in. Brilliant. Thank you. Thanks for all the comments that are coming in. Please contribute to the discussion. Certainly the most valuable bit for me. Diane, you said something. I missed what it was. Sorry, I haven't got my my chat open. Thanks, Love, for your comments. Thanks, Chloe. Thanks, Diane. Yeah, I will be. I'll turn off the recording now, actually, because people don't want me to hear me